The Final Threshold. Prologue. There is a book that was never supposed to survive. It was printed in the winter of 1922 in a small run on cheap paper that has long since gone the color of tea. The world was allowed to see a version of it. A polite version. A slim volume with a respectable title. Written by a quiet pharmacist in the east of France. That version still sits on library shelves. You can find it in an afternoon. But there was another version. The same hand. The same year. The same terrible discovery. But without the softening. Without the reassurance. Without the little mantra they taught the public to repeat while the real machinery stayed hidden underneath. This is that version. And I want to be honest with you before we go a single step further, because this is not a comfortable thing to hear. What is written in these pages is not a technique. It is not an affirmation. It is not something you add to your morning so your day goes a little smoother. It is a description of the machine you are already inside. Right now, wherever you are, feel the weight of your own body pressing down into whatever is holding you. The chair, the bed, the floor. Feel gravity doing the one thing it never stops doing, pulling you down toward the center of a world you did not choose and cannot see the edges of. That weight is older than your name. You have felt it every day since the day you were born. The day you came out of a warm and boundaryless dark into cold air and hard light and the crushing arrival of limits. You did not scream because of the cold. You screamed because you felt, in that first breath, the terrible heaviness of separation. Moments before, you were everything, floating in a void of pure potential. And then you were small, fragile, bordered, sentenced to a body. And somewhere in the years between then and now, you accepted something. You accepted that the world was solid, finished, handed to you. That your only job was to survive inside it as cleverly as you could, and to keep your hopes reasonable so they would not hurt so much when they broke. The manuscript says you were lied to, not by a person, by the architecture itself. The wall you are leaning against is not holding you in. You are holding it up. You are not a prisoner of reality. You are the one dreaming the prison into place night after night, without ever once suspecting your own hand in it. Every bar you have ever cursed, you cast. Every wall you have run into, you raised long ago, and then forgot you raised it. Over the next hour and a half, I'm going to take you down through this thing the way the manuscript takes you down. Not as a lecture, as a descent. 7 sealed chambers, one beneath the next, each one darker and closer to the source than the last. And at the bottom, past the final door,
not as a lecture,
there is a threshold that almost no one crosses. Not because it is far away, because of what it asks you to give up to reach it. Most people who find this book close it before the end. The thing in them that wants to stay small always finds a reason to look away right before the door. You are not going to be one of them. Let us begin the descent. Prologue. The delivery. Nobody handed you this. That's the first thing worth sitting with. Nobody walked up to you, looked you in the eye and said, "Here, you need this." It arrived the way these things always arrive. Sideways. At an hour you would rather have been asleep. In the middle of a week that was already too heavy to carry. You were scrolling, or you were driving. Or you were lying in the dark with the ceiling 3 feet from your face, doing the arithmetic on a life that does not add up, and something surfaced and you did not scroll past it. That hesitation is the only credential you need. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that brings a person here. Not the tiredness of a long day. Something older. The tiredness of a person who has done everything correctly and received nothing for it. Who followed the sequence: school, work, patience, decency, waiting your turn. And who has begun to suspect, quietly, in the part of the mind that does not speak out loud, that the sequence was never going to pay out. You have suspected for a while now that something is wrong with the world you were handed. Not wrong like broken, wrong like designed. Look at the architecture around you. Really look at it. The gray corridors, the hum of the lights that nobody ever turns off. The faces on the morning train, arranged in identical rows of quiet surrender. Every one of those people was told the same story you were told. Work hard, be realistic, manage your expectations, wait. And every one of them is waiting. That is not a society. That is a holding pattern. What you are about to hear is not encouragement. I want that clear before we go any further. Because if you came here for encouragement, you are going to find this cold. And you should leave now, while leaving is still easy. This is a manual. An engineering document. The kind of thing you would find bolted to the wall inside a machine room. Written for the person whose job is to operate the machine rather than be crushed by it. It describes a mechanism. It describes what the mechanism does when you touch the levers and what it does when you do not. It contains no promises because engineering documents do not promise. They specify. The mechanism it describes has 7 parts, 7 principles, sealed and stacked, each one resting on the one below it, like floors of a building sunk into the ground. We are going to descend through all 7, slowly, in order. Because they do not work as inspiration, and they do not work as fragments. They work the way a schematic works, which is to say only when you have the whole of it. And there is one more thing I need to tell you at the top. Though you will not understand why it matters until we reach the bottom. This book lied about where it came from. Deliberately, elaborately. It arrived wrapped in a false history, and it has been in continuous print for over a century on the strength of that false history. And the lie is not the scandal you think it is. The lie is the proof. By the time you understand what the author actually did, you will understand the first principle better than any explanation of it could teach you. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That is the last floor, and you have not entered the first. Take a breath. The air is about to change. Chapter 1. The Threshold, where the artifact came from. In the year 1460, a monk walked into the city of Florence carrying a bundle of papers he had found in a monastery in Macedonia. The papers were Greek, Old Greek, and they had come loose from a body of writing that Europe had been half remembering for 1,000 years, the way you half remember the shape of a room from a house you lived in as a child. Word reached Cosimo de' Medici, who ran Florence the way a hand runs a glove. Cosimo was, at that moment, funding one of the great intellectual projects of the age. He had a scholar named Marsilio Ficino, translating the complete works of Plato into Latin for the first time in history. That was the priority. That was the crown of the century. Cosimo saw what the monk had brought, and he told Ficino to put Plato down. Think about what that means. The wealthiest patron of learning in Europe looked at Plato, the foundation stone of Western thought, and decided that the papers in front of him were more urgent. Because Cosimo believed those papers were older. He believed they came from a sage called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, and that this sage had walked in Egypt before Plato was born, before Moses was born, at the headwaters of everything, Ficino obeyed. He translated the whole collection in a matter of months. And in 1471, it was published in Latin under a title that means, roughly, On the Power and Wisdom of God. What happened next is one of the strangest chapters in the history of ideas. Ficino's translation went through edition after edition, 20 and more before the middle of the following century. It ran through the mind of Renaissance Europe like current through wire. It shaped Pico della Mirandola. It shaped Giordano Bruno, who was burned for where it took him. It fed directly into the atmosphere of inquiry that made the scientific revolution thinkable in the first place, which is a fact most people find genuinely difficult to sit with, that the ancestor of the laboratory is a book of magic. For 150 years, Hermes Trismegistus was revered across learned Europe as the fountainhead of divine wisdom. Then, in 1614, a philologist named Isaac Casaubon took the texts apart word by word and demonstrated that they could not possibly be that old. His method was unglamorous and completely devastating. He looked at the vocabulary. He found terms that belonged to Hellenistic Greek philosophy, not to the Egypt of the pyramid builders. Demiurge, nous, logos, words with fingerprints on them, words that carried a date. The writings were not primeval. They were composed in the first few centuries of the Common Era, in Greek and Roman Egypt, by people who were doing something far more interesting than forging antiquities. They were writing in the voice of a god, because they had understood something and needed a vessel large enough to carry it. The texts were not ancient. They were correct. Those are different accusations. The prestige collapsed overnight. Hermes fell out of the universities and into the underground, where he was kept alive in lodges and secret societies and the private libraries of people who did not care what the philologists had decided. And that could have been the end of it. A discredited body of Greek mysticism, footnoted into silence, a curiosity for specialists. But the current did not stop. It went underground and it traveled. And 3 centuries later, it surfaced in the least mystical place on Earth. Chicago, 1908. A slim volume appeared from a small publisher called the Yogi Publication Society, operating out of the Masonic Temple building. The book was titled The Kybalion, and its subtitle claimed it was a study of the Hermetic philosophy of ancient Egypt and Greece. It was credited to no one. Or rather, it was credited to 3 people who did not exist, listed only as 3 initiates. The book laid out 7 principles, 7 laws it claimed were the sealed foundation beneath every mystery tradition that had ever operated. It said, in effect, that the whole of the occult inheritance of the human species could be compressed into 7 mechanical statements, and that anyone who understood all 7 would be able to operate reality rather than be operated by it. It has not gone out of print since. It became the most widely circulated occult book of the 20th century. It moved through New Thought circles and black nationalist reading rooms, through Freemasonry, through the founding documents of modern witchcraft, through the paperback boom, through the internet. Millions of copies, dozens of languages, passed hand to hand for over 100 years by people who mostly could not tell you where it came from. And here is the part I flagged at the top, and will not fully open until the end. The Kybalion quotes extensively from an ancient text called the Kybalion. That text does not exist. There is no antique manuscript by that name. No fragment, no citation in any earlier source, no trace of the word in the historical Hermetic literature. The scholarship on this is settled. The religious historian Philip Desleep who produced the definitive annotated edition, established the author as William Walker Atkinson, an American attorney, publisher, and New Thought writer who lived from 1862 to 1932, and who wrote the whole thing himself. The three initiates were one man. The ancient source he quotes from was written by the same hand that quoted it. Hold that. Do not resolve it yet. Do not decide whether it makes the book worthless or makes it something else entirely. Because the answer to that question is the last door in this building, and we have 6 floors to descend before we reach it. What matters at this threshold is only this. A man in Chicago wrote 7 statements about how reality operates, dressed them in a borrowed antiquity, and released them into the world. And whatever you conclude about his methods, those 7 statements have kept working on people for a century, in every language they have been carried into, on every kind of person who has picked them up, including you, tonight. So we descend, chamber by chamber. The first one is the floor everything else stands on, and it is the one that will cost you the most to accept. Chapter 2. The substrate, the principle of mentalism. The first principle states that everything which exists is mental in nature, that the universe you are standing in has the character of a thought rather than the character of a stone. Everyone nods at this. Almost nobody accepts it, because accepting it costs something specific, and I want to name the cost before I make the case. If reality is mental, then the wall between what happened to you and what you are is thinner than you have been treating it. And that is not a comfortable renovation to make on a life. Most of us have load-bearing beams made out of what happened to us. So let us not argue this mystically. Let us argue it the way an engineer would, from the instrument. You have never once in your life perceived the world directly. Not once. Not for a single second. Your eyes do not send pictures anywhere. They send electrochemical noise down a nerve into a dark chamber of tissue that has never seen light and never will. And inside that darkness, your brain constructs a model, a best guess, a prediction of what is most likely out there, given everything it has learned, which it then checks against the incoming noise and corrects on the fly. That is not mysticism. That is the dominant framework in contemporary neuroscience. It has a name, predictive processing, and it emerged from the work of researchers including Carl Friston, whose free energy principle gave it its mathematics, and Andy Clark and Anil Seth, who put it in a phrase most people never recover from. Perception, Seth says, is a controlled hallucination. Sit inside that for a second, because it is not a metaphor and it is not a flourish. The colors in the room you are in do not exist out there. The solidity of the chair holding you is a rendering. The face of the person you love most is a reconstruction assembled behind your eyes out of prediction and error correction, and you have never met the original. The brain is not a camera pointed at the world. It is a generator, and the world is the feedback that keeps it honest. Now follow the consequence, because this is where the chamber opens. If experience is a construction, then the model doing the constructing is not neutral. It is loaded. It was built out of what you were shown before you had any say in the matter, and it renders the world according to the specifications it was given. A person whose model says people leave will experience a room full of people leaving. Not because they are imagining it, because the prediction is doing the perceiving. Every ambiguous glance resolves toward the prediction. Every silence gets read in the direction of the expectation. And here is the mechanism that turns perception into circumstance, which sociology mapped almost 80 years ago, and mostly nobody applies to their own life. In 1948, Robert Merton published a paper in the Antioch Review called The Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. He was building on a theorem from William Isaac Thomas and Dorothy Swain Thomas, stated 2 decades earlier, which holds that when people define situations as real, those situations become real in their consequences. The shape of the thing is worth getting exactly right, because it has 3 moving parts and people usually only see the last one. It starts with a reading of a situation that is simply wrong. The wrong reading changes how the person behaves, and the changed behavior manufactures the very conditions that make the original wrong reading accurate. His illustration was a bank, a solvent bank. Healthy books, liquid assets, no reason on earth for it to fail. A rumor of insolvency starts. Enough depositors believe it. They queue, and the bank, which was never insolvent, becomes insolvent by the close of business, because a belief walked into the world. Wearing shoes. That is your life. That is the entire engine. The prediction is not a passive commentary on reality. The prediction is a set of instructions that your body executes. You approach the interview as a man who will not get it, and you carry that in your shoulders and your voice and the fractional hesitation before you answer, and the room reads it correctly, and you do not get it. And the model files another confirmation and tightens. This is the invisible prison, not a conspiracy of men in rooms. A recursive loop between what you assume and what you then produce, running continuously, without supervision, since roughly the age of 4. And now you understand why the sleeping world looks the way it does. Those faces on the morning train are not being oppressed by anything more sophisticated than their own unexamined predictions, executed faithfully for 40 years. But run the mechanism backward and you have found the door. If the loop runs on assumption, then assumption is the control surface. Not effort, not intention, not the frantic, exhausting labor of trying to force an outcome while privately expecting to fail, which is the state that nearly everyone who claims this doesn't work for me is actually operating from. 2 contradictory signals in one instrument. Of course, the needle does not move. The principle does not say, think positively. Nothing in this manual will ever ask you to think positively. The principle says the substrate of your world is mental. Therefore, the only place any change has ever originated is upstream, in the assumption before the behavior, before the outcome, before the evidence. You are not a victim of your circumstances. You are an author who forgot he was writing and started taking dictation from his own earlier pages. That is the first floor. The substrate is mental. But knowing the substrate is mental tells you nothing about how the mental becomes physical. And if you stop here, you will spend 2 years doing affirmations at a bathroom mirror and get nothing for it. The mechanism of transmission is the second chamber. And it is where most people who find this material fail. Chapter 3. The Blueprint Rule. The Principle of Correspondence. The second principle is the one everybody has heard and almost nobody uses correctly. As above, so below. As within, so without. It has been printed on so much merchandise that it has lost the capacity to mean anything. So let me strip the poetry off it and hand you the working version. Correspondence says that the same pattern repeats at every scale of a system, and therefore a plane you can observe will tell you accurate things about a plane you cannot. That is a diagnostic instrument. That is the most useful tool in this entire building, and it is sitting in plain sight, being used as a bumper sticker. Here is what it means in practice. You cannot see your assumptions. That is the central problem of this whole discipline. The assumptions doing the most damage to your life are precisely the ones that do not feel like assumptions, because they feel like facts about the world. Nobody walks around thinking, I believe I am fundamentally not worth choosing. They walk around thinking people are unreliable, and they experience that as an observation. The inner plane is opaque to you. You are inside it. But the outer plane is completely visible. Your calendar is visible. Your bank statement is visible. The quality of your friendships, the state of your rooms, the way people speak to you when they are tired and their manners drop away. All visible, all measurable. And by correspondence, the outer is a readout of the inner. Stop treating your life as a verdict and start treating it as telemetry. A pilot in cloud does not resent the artificial horizon for showing a bank angle. He does not argue with it, or feel shame about it, or ask why the instrument has singled him out. He reads it, and he corrects the aircraft, and the instrument changes because the aircraft changed. That is the correct relationship to your own conditions. They are not a judgment. They are a reading. So run the reading. Honestly, which is the hard part. Because the ego will fight you for every inch of this. If money arrives and immediately leaves, the outer plane is reporting an inner state that does not experience itself as a container. Something upstream believes that holding is not permitted, and the behavior executes that belief with impressive creativity. There will always be a reason. The reasons are downstream. The reasons are weather, not climate. If the same argument keeps recurring with different people, the outer plane is reporting that you are not in a series of unrelated conflicts. You are in one conflict, wearing successive faces. If you are exhausted in a life that is not objectively demanding, the outer plane is reporting that a great deal of the energy is going somewhere invisible, usually into maintenance, into holding up a version of yourself for inspection. None of that is an accusation. I want to be extremely clear about that, because this material has a well-documented failure mode, and I have watched it damage people. The failure mode is this. Somebody learns correspondence, looks at a genuine catastrophe in their life, an illness, a bereavement, a violence done to them as a child, and concludes that they authored it and deserved it. That is not the principle. That is the principle held by the wrong end. The world contains other operators. It contains accident, biology, history, and the free movement of billions of people who are not consulting you. Correspondence does not say you caused everything that happened to you. It says the current configuration of your inner world is legible in your outer world, right now, going forward. What was done to you is not your fault. What it installed is now your equipment. And equipment is the only category of thing that can be serviced. That distinction is the difference between this being a doctrine of blame and this being a doctrine of authority. Hold the line on it. There is a second use of correspondence that almost nobody is taught, and it is the more advanced one. Correspondence runs in both directions. If the outer reports the inner, then the outer can be used to address the inner, not by force, by congruence. You do not affirm your way into a new state while living in a room that argues with it. The state and the environment are the same statement at two scales, and they will resolve toward each other whether you supervise the process or not. This is why the small physical acts matter more than the long visualizations. Not because tidying a room is magic, because the room and the self are the same pattern at different resolutions, and moving one moves the other. The person who cannot hold money and the person whose paperwork is in a drawer they do not open are the same person, expressed at two scales. Address either one, and you are addressing both. So the second floor gives you a mirror and a lever. The mirror tells you what state you are actually in, as opposed to the one you have been telling people you are in. The lever lets you push on the state from either end. But a state is not a static thing. That is the assumption hiding underneath everything I have said so far. And it is wrong, and the third chamber is where it gets corrected. Chapter 4. The frequency. The principle of vibration. Nothing rests. That is the third principle in 3 words. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything is in a state of vibration. The physics of this is uncontroversial to the point of being boring. The desk you are sitting at is a storm. Atoms in continuous motion, bound in lattices that are themselves oscillating. And the solidity you experience is your nervous system's summary of a process happening far too fast for you to be shown the raw feed. Solidity is a rendering artifact. We covered that in the first chamber. What the principle adds is the operational claim, and this is where it becomes a manual rather than a description. Every state of mind you have ever occupied is a rate, not an object. That sounds like semantics until you use it. Consider how people talk about their own conditions. I am an anxious person. I have depression. I am not a confident man. Every one of those sentences is grammatically a statement about a possession or an essence. Something you have or something you are. Fixed, owned, part of the inventory. Now say it as a rate. I am currently running at a frequency where threat is weighted heavily and possibility is weighted lightly. Same condition. Completely different relationship to it. Because a thing you possess can only be removed by a process of loss, which is slow and painful and usually requires someone else's permission. But a rate can be changed. That is what rates do. They are the one category of phenomenon that has never in the history of the universe stayed constant. And you already know how to do this, which is the part that irritates people when I point it out. You have changed your own frequency deliberately, thousands of times, without ever calling it that. You put a specific song on before a specific kind of night. You went for the walk not because your body needed exercise, but because you needed to be a different man by the time you got back. You stood in a doorway for 4 seconds before entering a room and did something internally, wordlessly, that you have never had a name for. You have always been an operator. You just did not have the schematic, so you thought it was mood. Here is the operational core of this chamber, and it is the correction to the single most common failure in this entire discipline. You cannot argue a frequency into changing. Argument happens at one level. Frequency happens underneath it. That is why the man lying awake at 3 in the morning, listing all the reasons his fear is irrational, stays afraid until dawn. The reasons are excellent. The reasons are correct. And they are being delivered to the wrong department. The rate does not respond to evidence. It responds to entrainment. Put oscillating systems on a shared surface, and they will pull each other into phase. That is a physical fact you can demonstrate on a kitchen table with 2 cheap metronomes and a board. It is also, and this is not a metaphor, an accurate description of what happens to a human being who spends 4 hours a week with a specific person. You are in training constantly. To rooms, to voices, to the ambient frequency of whatever you have your attention immersed in. And most people's inner state is not authored at all. It is the average of everything they have failed to filter. Which means the highest leverage act available to you this week is not a technique. It is an audit. What are you standing on the same surface as? Who are you in phase with? What is running in the background of your rooms for 9 hours a day while you tell yourself you are not really listening? You are always really listening. The gray architecture does not maintain itself by persuading you of anything. Persuasion would be expensive, and you might resist it. It maintains itself by keeping the ambient frequency low and constant, and letting entrainment do the rest for free. Nobody is arguing you into smallness. You are being tuned into it, continuously, by ambience. And the counter move is not to argue back. It is to change what you are on the surface with, and then hold the new rate long enough for it to stop feeling like a costume. There is a practical sequence here, and it takes about 90 seconds, which is the only reason I'm giving it to you, because you will not do anything that takes longer. First, you interrupt the physical posture, not because posture is magic, but because the body is holding the rate, and the body is the part of the system you have direct mechanical access to. Stand up. Change the angle of your spine. Slow the exhale until it is longer than the inhale, 4 or 5 times. That alone will not change your life, and it will change the rate, which is all we are doing. Second, you change the ambient. Whatever is running in the background gets turned off, deliberately, with your hand. Silence for a moment is not a spiritual gesture. It is removing every other oscillator from the surface so that yours is the only one on it. Third, and this is the part that does the work, you occupy a memory in which you were already at the rate you want. Not a fantasy. A memory. Something that actually happened, in which you were certain, or unbothered, or dangerous in the quiet way that competent people are dangerous. Your nervous system has the file. It has already run that configuration, and it knows the settings, which means you are not constructing a state from nothing. You are recalling one from the archive. That is why memory works when affirmation fails. Affirmation asks the system to accept a claim it has no record of. Recall asks it to reload a state it has already executed. 90 seconds. Posture, ambient, recall. And then you go into the room, or the call, or the conversation, at a rate you selected rather than one you inherited from the last 4 hours of ambient noise. Do that twice a day for a fortnight, and you will discover something that irritates most people when they find it out. A great deal of what you had classified as your personality was just your default rate, running unsupervised since childhood. Which brings us to the 4th chamber, and to the question everyone who has ever tried this eventually collides with. What do you do about the parts of yourself you cannot change? The fear and the resentment and the hunger that do not respond to any of this. What do you do with the material that will not move? The answer in the 4th chamber is that you were never supposed to move it. You were supposed to turn it. Chapter 5. The dial, the principle of polarity. The 4th principle says that everything has 2 poles, that opposites are identical in nature and differ only in degree, and that all paradoxes can be reconciled. That is the technical language. Here is what it actually gives you. Heat and cold are not 2 substances. There is no cold in the room being fought back by heat. There is one thing, temperature, and 2 directions on it. The words hot and cold do not name entities. They name positions on a single scale. Now apply that to the interior. Love and hate are not 2 forces. They are one intensity, pointed, which is why they convert into each other so violently and so often, and why indifference, not hatred, is the actual opposite of love. Indifference is not the far pole. Indifference is 0 on the scale. Fear and faith are one faculty. Both are the act of vividly inhabiting an outcome that has not occurred. The mechanism is identical. The bodily process is identical. The only difference is which end of the dial the imagination is pointed at. And I have never met an anxious person who lacked imaginative power. I have met a great many with an enormous amount of it, running at full output, aimed the wrong way. Understand what this does to your entire strategy. Every self-improvement system you have ever encountered operates on an elimination model. Get rid of the fear. Kill the ego. Remove the resentment. Stop being angry. Cut out the part of you that is broken, and you will be left with something clean. It does not work, and now you know why it cannot work. You are trying to remove one end of a scale. There is no operation that deletes cold while leaving temperature intact. What you are actually doing when you attempt this is suppression. And suppressed material does not disappear, it goes below the waterline and steers. The principle offers a different operation entirely. Not elimination, transmutation. You do not remove the charge. You move it along its own scale. The rage you have been trying to be a better person about is not a defect. It is energy, at a position, and it is one of the most portable resources you own. It moves along the scale toward resolve, toward refusal, toward the specific and useful capacity to say no in a room where everyone else is nodding. That transit is short. That transit is available to you in about 4 seconds when you know the dial is there. Grief moves along its scale toward devotion, and anyone who has lost someone and then built something in their name has already run this operation without a name for it. Envy is the ugliest one to admit to and the most immediately useful. Envy is precise. It is a targeting system that has already identified, without consulting your pride, exactly what you want and have decided you are not permitted to have. Turn the dial and envy becomes specification. It stops being a wound and becomes a document. There is a rule that governs whether this works, and it is the same rule that governs the whole building. You can only transmute along a scale. You cannot jump between scales. That is the error that wrecks people. Someone in the bottom of a depression is told to feel abundant, and the instruction is not merely unhelpful, it is mechanically impossible. Those are not neighboring positions. That is asking a man in a basement to be on the roof, without stairs, by wanting it. The correct move from the bottom of despair is not joy. It is irritation. Irritation is one position up. Irritation still has motion in it. A man who is irritated has re-entered the world of preference, which means something in him has started making claims again. And from irritation, you can reach frustration. And from frustration, you can reach determination. And from determination, the roof is a set of stairs rather than a fantasy. Nobody tells you this. Every piece of content you have consumed on this subject has told you to leap, and then quietly implied it was a failure of belief when you could not. It was never belief. It was distance. So the fourth floor hands you something that the other three do not. It hands you a use for the parts of yourself you have been at war with since you were old enough to notice them. The shadow, the old man, whatever name you have been carrying for the version of you that sabotages and rages and wants ugly things. He is not the enemy of this work. He is the fuel supply. He has been holding your unspent charge for you this entire time, in the only form he was permitted to hold it in. You do not kill him. You put him to work. Which raises the question this chamber cannot answer, and it is the question that has ended more of these journeys than any other. If the dial is always in reach, why does it keep sliding back? Why does the state you built on Sunday night evaporate by Wednesday? Why does every genuine breakthrough get followed, with almost mechanical reliability, by a collapse that feels like proof you were fooling yourself? That is the fifth chamber. It is the deepest floor in this building. It is the one that costs the most people their entire practice, and it is the reason most of them quit 6 weeks in believing this does not work. It works. They just did not know about the swing. Chapter 6. The pendulum. The principle of rhythm. Everything swings. In, out. Rise, fall. Advance, retreat. The tide does it. The seasons do it. Markets do it. Empires do it. And your interior does it with a regularity that would be beautiful if it were not currently ruining your life. The fifth principle states that the measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. The rhythm compensates. Whatever the pendulum does in one direction, it will do in the other. And now I am going to tell you the thing that would have saved you years if anyone had told you at the beginning. The backswing is not failure. The backswing is the confirmation that the swing was real. Run this against your actual experience, not the theory, your experience. Every genuine elevation you have ever achieved was followed by a collapse. You had the week where everything was clear, where you could feel it working, where you caught yourself thinking, so this is what it's like to be someone who is not fighting himself. And then Wednesday arrived with a specific kind of gray in it. And by Friday, you were lower than before you started. And you concluded what everyone concludes, that the good week was a fluke, an emotional high, self-deception, that the crash was the truth and the elevation was the lie. You had it exactly backwards, and the diagnosis cost you the practice. The depth of the return swing is a measurement of the height of the outward one. That is not consolation, that is instrumentation. The crash is telling you the magnitude of the elevation. And if you can read it as data instead of experiencing, it is verdict. You have just acquired the single most valuable skill in this entire manual. Because here is what actually happens to people, and I want to describe it precisely. Because you will recognize it. The swing back does not arrive as a mood. It arrives as an argument. It arrives wearing the voice of realism. It sounds like the most sensible thing you have thought in weeks. It says, quietly and reasonably, that you have been ridiculous, that people like you do not get out, that you have done this before, twice, 3 times, and each time you eventually came back to this room and this bed and this exact hour of the morning, and the only thing that changed was that you were older. That voice is not your enemy. It is not even a stranger. It is the old man running the return arc. And he is very good at his job because he has been doing it since you were small, and he has your entire archive. Do not argue with him. We established in the 3rd chamber that argument is delivered to the wrong department. You do something else instead, and it is the most sophisticated operation in this book. You refuse to move to the far end, not by resisting the swing. You cannot resist a pendulum, and everyone who tries gets taken along anyway with the added humiliation of having struggled. You do it by declining to identify with the arc while it is happening. The old texts called this polarizing at the desired pole. Practically, it means occupying the still point at the top of the arm, where the swing is happening below you and you are watching the readout rather than riding the weight. In plain operational terms, it is a single sentence held without flinching at 3 in the morning. The swing is occurring. I am not the swing. That is it. That is the whole technique. It is unglamorous, and it is nearly impossible the first 4 times, and it changes everything about how far the arm carries you. Because a pendulum that is not fed loses amplitude every cycle. That is what damping is. The arc narrows on its own if you stop pouring energy into it. And identification is the energy. Every time you agree with the argument at 3 in the morning, you push the weight. Every time you observe it without agreeing, the next swing is shorter. 6 weeks of this, and the arc has narrowed to something you can live inside. That is not a promise. It is a mechanical consequence. And it is why the people this works for look from the outside like they got lucky with their temperament. They did not get lucky. They stopped feeding the weight. If you have made it to this floor, you are not a casual listener. Most of the people who started this are gone, and they left somewhere around the second chamber, because this is not comfortable material and it does not flatter anyone. You are still here. Subscribe and stay for what we open next. The archive releases one of these every week, and the next transmission goes into the mechanism this chamber only touched. The discipline of the interior silence and what actually happens in the days between the assumption and the evidence. Now, back into the dark. There are 2 floors left, and the 6th one is where the manual stops describing you and starts describing what you are permitted to do to other people. One thing before we descend, because we are close enough now that it needs saying a second time. The man who wrote these 7 principles claimed he was transmitting them from a source that did not exist. He wrote the ancient text, and then he wrote the commentary on the ancient text, and he signed the commentary with 3 names that were all his. And the thing has run continuously for over a century in every language it has touched, on people who never checked. I told you at the top that this is the proof rather than the scandal. 2 chambers from now, you will see exactly why, and I suspect you are already beginning to. Chapter 7. The Chain. The Principle of Cause and Effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Nothing in this system escapes law, and what people call chance is only a name for causes they have not identified. That last part is the whole chamber, so let me put it down carefully. Chance is not a force. Chance is a confession of ignorance, stated as if it were a description of the world. When you say something happened by chance, you are reporting the limits of your own tracking, not a gap in the machinery. And that has an uncomfortable consequence for how you have been living. The old teachers divided people into 2 categories, and it was not the rich and the poor or the wise and the foolish. It was causes and effects. Almost everyone alive spends their life on the plane of effects. They are moved, they react. Something arrives and they respond to it. And something else arrives and they respond to that. And if you tracked the actual origin of their day, you would find that almost nothing in it originated with them. Their mood was set by weather and traffic and a message someone sent at 8 in the morning. Their opinions arrived from a feed. Their ambitions were installed by comparison. Their fears were installed by people who died before they were born. Being an effect is not a character flaw. It is the default state of the instrument. It requires no maintenance, no attention, and no courage, which is precisely why the gray architecture is built out of it. The manual does not tell you to escape the law. You cannot escape the law. It tells you to rise on the plane, to become a cause on your own level, while remaining an effect of the levels above you, which is the only honest version of freedom anyone has ever been offered. In practice, this is smaller and harder than it sounds. It means intercepting the chain at the one link where you have jurisdiction. Something arrives. There is a gap, then a response. Everyone experiences that gap as instantaneous, but it is not, and the entire discipline lives inside it. The person who becomes a cause is simply the person who has widened that gap by a fraction of a second, over and over, until there is room in it to choose. Widening it is a physical skill, and it has almost nothing to do with wisdom. The message arrives, and there is a pull in the chest, and the reply is already forming. And it is a good reply. It is devastating. It is completely justified. The gap in that moment is about 1/5 of a second wide. You do not need to be a better person to widen it. You need to install a physical interruption between the pull and the execution, because the chain runs through the body, and the body is where it can be broken. Put the phone face down. Stand. Get water. It is unbelievably crude, and it works because you have inserted an action that is not the reaction, and the chain has to root around it. Do it enough times, and the gap widens on its own. Not because you became disciplined, because you built a habit of non-immediacy and the machinery adapted. That is what rising on the plane actually looks like from the inside. It is not serenity. It is a man putting a phone face down and going to the kitchen for no reason. That is it. That is the whole of the 6th floor. Not control over events, jurisdiction over the link between the event and what you become in response to it. Now, the ethics. I have to address this directly because this material is currently being taught at enormous scale by people who have removed the ethical section entirely. And what is left is a technique for treating other human beings as furniture. If assumption shapes what unfolds, the immediate question every single person asks, usually within a week, is whether it can be pointed at another person. Whether you can assume someone back. Whether you can install a state in a man who has not consented to it. The honest answer is that influence between people is real, well documented, and does not require any mysticism to explain. Expectation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes response, and human beings entrain to each other constantly. We covered the mechanism in the 3rd chamber. Of course, it points outward. So the question is not can it. The question is what it costs, and the manual is clear about this in a way its modern imitators are not. Every act of causation lands on the plane it was launched from. Understand the mechanics rather than the morality here, because the morality is downstream of the mechanics and always was. To hold another person in a fixed state, you must first hold yourself in the state of a man for whom that person's compliance is necessary. That is the price of admission, and it is not optional. You have to occupy need in order to project control. You have installed dependency in yourself as the operating cost of attempting to install obedience in them. You cannot make yourself the cause of another person's obedience without also making yourself the effect of their resistance. Every hour of that work makes you smaller. This is why the golden rule survives in traditions that have no interest in being nice. It is not sentiment. It is a load specification. What you do to others runs through you on the way out and again on the way back. And there is no configuration of the machine in which it does not. The operator's version of this is disciplined and unromantic. You do not manipulate persons. You occupy states, and you let the world reorganize around the state. You do not assume that a specific man calls you. You assume that you are a woman who is chosen, and you let the world work out the logistics, which it is far better equipped to do than you are. Same principle. Radically different position on the dial. One of them requires another person to be diminished for you to be satisfied. The other does not require anyone to be diminished at all, and produces results that do not evaporate when you stop maintaining them. The 6th floor is the moral spine of the building. Cause and effect is not a threat, and it is not karma in the greeting card sense. It is an accounting identity. Everything you send out is entered on both sides of the ledger, which leaves one chamber. And the 7th is the one that explains why nothing you have learned in the first 6 has worked yet. Chapter 8. The 2 hands. The principle of gender. The 7th principle says that gender is in everything, that everything has its generative pair, and that nothing is created by one alone. Strip the word of everything the last century has loaded onto it, because the principle is not talking about men and women. It is talking about a functional pair that operates inside every single mind, regardless of who owns it. 2 roles. one generative act. The old language called them the masculine and feminine principles of mind. Modern language would call them the projecting function and the gestating function. And I will use the old names only because the manual does. And I will define them so precisely that no confusion is possible. The projecting function is will and direction. It decides. It states. It has no ability whatsoever to create anything on its own. And that is the part everybody misses. The gestating function is receptive and formative. It takes what is impressed upon it and it grows the thing out into structure over time, without supervision, and largely without your permission. It also has no ability to originate. It only ever develops what it was handed. Every person carries both. Every act of creation in the history of the species has required both. And here is why your practice has not worked. You have been running the projecting function continuously and never handing anything over. You decide, and then you decide again. You state the intention, and 40 minutes later you check whether it is working. And checking is a fresh act of will, which is a fresh impression, which resets the gestation. You plant, and you dig it up to look at the roots, and you plant, and you dig it up. Then you conclude that the soil is dead. You have not failed to plant. You have failed to stop digging. The soil is not dead. It has never once been left alone long enough to do the only thing it knows how to do. This is the discipline that separates people who get results from people who accumulate techniques. And it is not a technique itself. It is a refusal. The impression is made once, cleanly, fully occupied, felt as already true, held for as long as it holds. And then it is released into a faculty you do not supervise, and you go and live your life like a person who has already been answered. The interval between the impression and the evidence is the entire test, and nobody warns you about what happens inside it. What happens is that the world produces a run of events that look like the opposite of what you asked for. This is so common, it should be printed on the first page of every book on this subject. The old teachers called it the bridge of incidents, and the crossing of it is unpleasant in a way that has ended more practices than any doubt ever has. You assume abundance, and a bill arrives. You assume reconciliation, and the silence gets louder. The gestating function is reorganizing structure, and structure does not reorganize politely. Something has to come apart for something else to take its shape. Nearly everyone reads the bridge as refusal. They see the bill and conclude the answer was no. The bill is the answer being no longer avoidable. You will not be able to tell the difference from inside it. That is not a flaw in your discernment. It is a structural feature of the position you are standing in. And the only workable response is the one from the fifth chamber. The swing is occurring. I am not the swing. Now the hard cases, because the material I have given you so far assumes a life with some slack in it. And a great many of the people listening tonight do not have any. If you are in debt that you cannot see the end of, if you are sick, if someone you needed is gone, the instruction to occupy a state and release it is going to sound obscene, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. So here is the version that works under load. You do not attempt the whole outcome. Under real duress, the projecting function cannot hold a large impression, and every failed attempt to hold one becomes fresh evidence against you. So you shrink the impression until it is small enough to be occupied without strain. Not I am debt-free. That is unoccupiable from inside a kitchen at 11 at night with an envelope on the table. Instead, the smallest true thing adjacent to it. I am a man who opens his mail. That is it. That is the entire impression, and it is occupiable, and it is upstream of everything else in the situation. Not I am healed. That one can be actively cruel, and I have watched it isolate people from care they needed. Instead, I am a person who is being taken care of properly, which points at doctors and food and sleep and the people who have offered and been refused, and which is a state you can actually enter tonight. And grief does not take an impression at all, so do not attempt one. Grief is not a state to be transmuted, and anyone who tells you to raise your frequency out of it is selling something. Grief is the fifth principle at full amplitude, and the only correct operation is the one from the pendulum chamber. You let it swing, and you do not identify with the arc. And you wait, and the arc narrows over a period measured in seasons rather than days. None of this is a substitute for the material world. If you are ill, this manual does not replace a doctor. If you are in danger, it does not replace leaving. The first principle says the substrate is mental. It does not say the bailiff is imaginary. What it says is that even in the worst room you have ever sat in, there remains one link in the chain over which you retain jurisdiction, and it is upstream of everything, downstream of it. The two hands, working correctly, look almost boring from the outside. A single clean impression. Then a long, unremarkable, undramatic refusal to interfere. That is the whole practice. Everything else is decoration. Chapter 9. The assembly. 7 floors. Put them together, because they were never 7 ideas. They are one machine described from 7 angles, and it only runs assembled. The substrate is mental, so the origin of every condition is upstream of the condition. The pattern repeats at every scale, so your outer world is a readable instrument panel for an inner world you cannot observe directly. Nothing is static, so every state you occupy is a rate rather than a possession. And rates are the one thing in the universe that have never held still. Opposites are degrees of one thing, so nothing in you needs to be destroyed, only moved along its own scale, one position at a time. Everything swings, so the collapse that follows your elevation is a measurement rather than a verdict. And the arc narrows the moment you stop feeding it. Nothing escapes causation. So you may rise on the plane and become a cause on your own level. And everything you send out is entered on both sides of the ledger. And nothing is created by one function alone. So the impression must be made once, cleanly, and then released to a faculty that will not perform for an audience. That is the manual. That is the entire document. And you now have it in a form that took the people who came before you decades, and secret societies, and considerable personal expense to assemble. The question is what you are going to do between now and Thursday. Because here is the failure mode of a night like this. You will feel this. You will feel it strongly for somewhere between 4 hours and 2 days, and that feeling will be pleasant enough to substitute for the work. Then Thursday will arrive with its own weather, and the whole building will fade like a dream you can only recall the architecture of. So take 1 floor, not 7. 1. If you have no idea which, take the second, because the second is the only one that requires nothing of you except honesty. Read the panel. Write down what your outer conditions are currently reporting about your inner state in flat language without softening any of it, and without turning it into a case against yourself. That single page will be more useful to you than any visualization you attempt this month. Chapter 10. The forgery, and now the last door, which I have opened twice already and never walked through. The book that carried these 7 principles into the 20th century was published in Chicago in 1908 under the names of 3 initiates who did not exist. It presented itself as the transmission of an ancient Hermetic text called the Kabbalion, which it quoted throughout, and which has never been found because it was never lost. because it was never written by anyone except the man writing the quotations. William Walker Atkinson, attorney, publisher, New Thought writer. One man in a city of stockyards and elevated trains, sitting down and inventing his own ancestry. Every instinct you have been trained with says that this discredits the thing. Follow the principle instead of the instinct. He assumed a lineage. He occupied it completely, wrote from inside it without flinching, and released it into the world as an already accomplished fact. He did not argue for its antiquity. He did not build a case. He simply operated as a man transmitting something ancient and declined to dig up the seed. And the world reorganized around the assumption. It has been in continuous print for over a century. It moved through New Thought and Freemasonry and black nationalist reading rooms and the founding of modern witchcraft and the paperback boom and the internet. Millions of copies, dozens of languages, generations of people who built entire lives on it. Go back to Merton's Bank, a solvent institution, no reason to fail, brought down by a definition of the situation that was false when it started and true by closing time. The belief walked into the world wearing shoes and rearranged the facts to match itself. Atkinson ran the same operation in the opposite direction. A book with no ancestry assumed an ancestry, and the assumption produced the lineage retroactively. Because 100 years of people treating it as foundational is exactly what a foundational text is. There is no other qualification. The tradition is downstream of the assumption. It always was. The manual is not a description of the law. The manual is an instance of it. Which brings this all the way back to the room you are sitting in. You have been waiting for a qualification, some piece of evidence from your own history that would license you to become the thing you want to be. A record of success, a family that produced people like that. Some proof, somewhere in your archive, that a person of your material is permitted to occupy the position. There is no such document. There has never been such a document for anybody, and every person you have ever admired was operating without one. You do not need a lineage. You need to assume one, and then refuse to dig it up. Chapter 11. The Return. You came here with a life that does not add up, and you are leaving with a schematic. That is not a small exchange. Whether it becomes anything is now entirely a matter of what you do with the floor of it before Thursday. The building does not close. It has been open for 118 years, and, in one form or another, for about 18 centuries before that. Nobody handed you this. You found it. And whatever brought you here at this hour, on this night, in the particular condition you are in, is worth taking seriously for the simple reason that most people never look up at all. The next descent is already open, and it goes into the interval nobody survives comfortably, the days between the impression and the evidence, and what the world does to you while you are crossing. It is on screen now. Go.